So thanks everybody for joining us on the first day of spring. Laura Kindseth is going to make a presentation here on steps to managing a successful construction grant. And she will start whenever she is ready.
Yes, I'm ready. And thank you again for joining us today for the Legacy Grants Office webinar number 15. And I do hope that you and yours are all safe and well today. We created this webinar series to provide helpful tips for grant applications and grant management to help make your project a success. I hope that today's webinar will provide useful tips and guidance through the essential steps to managing a successful construction grant. Before you begin with building preservation steps, it's important to ensure that your building is eligible for a historic properties grant, as defined on page 104 of the grants manual. This requirement is that all properties must be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or in the case of pre-development research grants, they only need to be determined eligible for listing, which means that the National Register property evaluation has been completed. With this requirement in place, you are ready to begin with that most important first step, and then look at what to expect during your grant projects and what your responsibilities are. Compare the grants process to the construction process. You begin with a solid foundation and work your way toward the top. So, step 1 is your pre-development research grant, your foundation and preservation planning document. The most commonly used are conditions assessment, which is an evaluation of building conditions from the foundation through the roof, plus a brief history and identification of historic elements, as well as existing conditions at the building. This grant request typically falls into the small grant category of $10,000 or less. A historic structure report may be in order at a highly significant or large and more complex property, and includes, in addition to the building conditions assessment, a very comprehensive historical component and documentation of historic elements. Requests for an HSR should fall into the large grant category. An important tip here that applies to the entire preservation process is the importance of hiring a well-qualified historic architect at this point. For the required qualifications, you can refer to the National Park Service standards listed on the resource page at the end of this webinar. You can begin your search for an architect at the Preservation Specialists directory on our website. Do keep in mind that this is merely a listing of professionals who have worked on historic properties and not necessarily recommended or approved. So you will need to do a thorough investigation of all candidates to ensure that they have the required expertise for your project. Then be sure to follow the procurement process for the correct dollar threshold of your grant request for your notification of your request for proposals. For a description of this process, refer to Appendix I of the grants manual. And note also that although the informal notice here requires that you contact a minimum of 3 prospects, we like to recommend that you contact many more candidates in order to receive a larger pool of candidates, as all all candidates may not respond. When you have narrowed down your list of proposals, it's time to do the final evaluation by asking for examples of previous assessment projects, and they should be able to provide digital copies for you. Then follow up by doing individual interviews, whether by phone or in person. This is the best way to understand if they're really qualified and know what is needed for these projects. So the main question you might want to ask is if they have a good understanding of the Secretary of Interior's standards for treatment of historic properties, and ask them how they would apply these standards to your building. Also note here that these are the standards that we reference throughout the preservation process. And there's also a link to the standards at the resource page at the end of the webinar. So the reason we recommend that you take this time to thoroughly vet your architectural candidates is, number one, because the future work at your building will be based on recommendations that they have made in this report, and they must meet the Secretary of Interior's standards, as you know. And also, this is the architect that you will likely be working with throughout all preservation phases. And of course, they're the ones who should be the most informed about all the nuts and bolts of your building. You are not required to hire the architect prior to applying for the grant, but beginning the process beforehand will, of course, give you a head start, plus necessary cost estimates for your application. Be sure to describe in your application the procurement process that you intend to use or that you have used for hiring. So after receiving your grant award, you should review your contract and complete the hiring process for a qualified historic architect so the assessment process can begin. First thing you need to do is discuss the plans for future building use with your architect, and this way it will help to determine the treatment approach according to the Secretary of Interior standards that will be applied to all future work at your building. And that is why this is so critical to have this step performed first. Now, the 4 treatment approaches as described by the Secretary of Interior standards are preservation, which focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and retention of a property's form as it has evolved over time. In other words, the building is a record of the history. Restoration depicts the property at a particular period of time in its history while removing evidence of other periods. Reconstruction recreates vanished or non-surviving portions of a property for interpretive purposes. And the last one, which we typically use in grant projects, is rehabilitation, because this approach acknowledges the need to alter or add to a historic property to meet continuing or changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. So again, rehabilitation is the typical choice because these buildings will need to meet codes for use as public buildings. So, what can you expect in your final report document? During the building assessment process, your architect will identify building character-defining features and conditions requiring treatment, document these conditions, make recommendations for treatments, prioritize the work according to most critical need, and provide an estimate for each treatment, thus providing the elements to create a preservation plan for all future intervention at the building. And another note for the final report, be sure that the legacy logo and acknowledgement are displayed in the report according to the instructions in the Manage Your Grant section at the MNHS website. So now that all this information has been gathered, it's time to evaluate priorities, cost estimates, and your organization's capacity to manage a construction grant. We recommend that you consult with your architect to plan your first construction project and any phasing if that'll be necessary for your grant process. So once you have a clear idea of the work to be included in your construction project, it's time to move on to the construction documents phase and applying for that grant. So describing a well-planned scope of your project makes a strong application. Typically, these grants will fall into the large grant category, which is very competitive, but this depends on the scope of the project. If you are phasing recommended work, be sure to clearly define your phasing plan in the narratives and ensure that your architect has delineated phases in the drawings and scope of work form to clarify for reviewers. You will likely continue working with your architect who conducted the conditions assessment, so you can use the pre-existing contract option for procurement. Just be sure to attach your existing signed contract to the application. If you are not continuing on with this architect, you will need to follow the procurement process once again to hire a new architect. So an important tip here, the photos that are required as an attachment for this grant, it's really important that they illustrate the building conditions well as the building context. So good detailed photos of all the conditions that will be addressed in your construction project so that the reviewers have a good visual sense of the building. The photos should be individually labeled as the location at the building and then incorporated into one photo file before uploading to the application. We ask that you do not upload individual photos. So, you have received your award for the grant, and congratulations. You should now notify your architect of milestone reviews that are required by the grants office so they can plan the project schedule accordingly. Drawings will be reviewed at 30%, 60%, and 90% completion. At the 90% milestone, a draft scope of work form is also required. A clear and complete scope of work form is essential as you move on to a grant application for construction work. So be sure at this time your architect is aware of the importance of this document. Because this describes, as you can see, well, the existing features and condition, and then you need to go on and describe the methods and materials that will be used and how the work will impact historic fabric at this form. You will also want to double check to ensure that photo and drawing reference numbers, which need to be incorporated into this form, all correspond to the correct item. This is also very important so the reviewers won't be confused and they'll know exactly where to look to illustrate the item that you're talking about. So this also is a good time to mention to your architect, if you're planning on moving on to a construction grant, that you will need a photo key plan to submit with your next application. So the guidelines for that can be found at Appendix H of the Grants Manual. And also note here that grant-funded construction drawings should also display the legacy logo and acknowledgement. So, your construction drawings and scope of work form are complete. Project scope is defined, and that would be including the phasing if needed. You have an estimated project budget and a comprehensive photo file. You're ready to complete your pre-application for a construction grant. The required pre-application allows you to receive an initial review by the grants office and the opportunity to make revisions or additions to your final application. After review recommendations are received from the grants office, be sure to review them carefully, revise your application as needed, and as always, let us know if you have questions about any of the revisions. It is important here to cross-reference your project description, budget, drawings, and scope of work form to ensure that all work items included in this project, in other words, in your project description narrative, are addressed in each document. Review your budget with your architect to ensure figures are current and all items such as a contingency, which is the amount allocated to cover unforeseen circumstances and is typically 10% of the construction costs. Construction administration and prevailing wage are all covered. Although a cash match is not required for legacy grants, even a small match based on your organization's capacity will help to strengthen your application. Because these large grant applications are so competitive and you will want to submit an outstanding application, it's beneficial to proofread the entire application for errors and omissions, possibly even have a third party review the application so that you can double check for errors and omissions. And also it's a good idea to double and triple check that you have all of your required attachments in place. That would be the drawings, scope of the work form, photo key, photo file, and if necessary, the phasing plan. Again, please incorporate all your photos into one file. At this point, labeling all of your attachments, because you have a few requirements for this application, is really important, and clearly labeled attachments will definitely help the reviewers know which documents they need to open and review. This is really important for reviewing your documents. So please, rather than using a numbering system that you might be familiar with, label with a clear reference to the name of the project and the type of the document. So, congratulations on getting another grant award. Right after the celebration, it would be most beneficial if you just dig right into the grant contract so you know what your responsibilities are during the grant process. First of all, be aware of the grant project period for scheduling purposes. And also review with your architect. Review the contract details such as payment schedule, milestone review requirements. For example, Section 4, which is the payment schedule, will describe milestones that are required and the payments that are attached to your grant. Documents, financial info should you want to make sure that that info is kept on file. And because you will need to submit all payment documentation at the final report. Again, the legacy acknowledgement and logo should be, is actually required to be posted at all grant construction sites. And again, the logo instructions are located in the Manage Your Grants section of our website. It's also a good idea to just review the entire Manage Your Grant section for additional details or anything you might have missed. This is another important job for your architect. So it's very important to retain your architect, even though the conditions assessment, construction drawings are all complete. This is because your architect will need to be on site to observe the work in progress, to ensure that it's on schedule, to review proposed products, and observe construction techniques to ensure that all products and methods will meet standards, and to ensure that existing historic materials are being protected while work is underway. As noted earlier, Grants Office milestone reviews are required at construction projects. Typical masonry milestones seen here require that if new masonry is necessary, it must match existing historic. And also that new mortar for repointing must match existing historic in texture, color, strength, composition, joint profile. These photos that clearly show a good match between existing and new will satisfy this milestone requirement. Your architect or contractor will be able to provide these photos for you to submit with your report. Another milestone requirement you can expect is the Grants Office site visit to observe construction techniques in progress, and sometimes the opportunity to review proposed new materials on site, which gives us a much better impression of color and texture. Construction, scheduling, and administrative issues that may arise can also be discussed at this time. Your responsibility at this milestone is to coordinate the on-site meeting scheduling with all parties involved. Your last milestone for a construction project is the final report, which can be submitted only when all previous milestones have been satisfied. It is important here to understand exactly what the final report requirements are. First, remember to call in to the monthly final report conference call with the grant specialist, Melinda Hutchinson, held the first Wednesday of each month at 2 p.m. This will give you the opportunity to ask questions specific to your project. Be sure to watch for the email alerts and RSVP to Gillian McGuire for call-in instructions. And this contact info is also listed on the resources page. So, as instructed at your conference call, be sure that you fill out the final report form questions, including the grant expenditures table. This is the table that pulls in your budget estimates from your grant application. You will also need to upload copies of invoices, receipts, and payroll records to document all grant expenses. Also, you will need to create another photo file to upload, this time containing before and after photos of all completed work. So it is best to take your after photos that correspond to your before photos so you can get a better comparison of the work that's been completed. So here are a few last notes and checklist of tips from this webinar, which are very important. Long-term planning and building assessment, of course, your first step, and your foundation. And this will guide all your future work that's being done at your building. Proofread your applications and check attachments. A clear, concise, and error-free application is always more competitive. Select a qualified architect. Thoroughly evaluate the qualifications, as this is the architect that you will likely work with throughout the construction process. Know your grant responsibilities, and you will find these in your contracts, so be sure to read that carefully, take notes, make a schedule. You will need to then pay attention to the project schedule and milestones to ensure that you are submitting everything on time and you'll stay on schedule. Good communication is also helpful. Be sure to ask us questions anytime you're not sure about a milestone or something that your contractor may be doing. We're always here to help. And then again, be sure to display the acknowledgement as appropriate. So here is that list of resources that are referenced here in this webinar and probably throughout the grant process. The grants manual, of course, which you can find online, and the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. It's a good document to take a look at, see what the 10 standards are for rehab. Preservation briefs are often referred to when the construction work starts in the scope of work form, because they help to describe the methods and materials that are being used for the work. So, and also Preservation Brief 43 is a good guide if you choose to do a historic structure report. The Minnesota State Register is a good resource for posting your RFP for your consultants and contractors. The National Park Service Professional Qualification Standards, and this will tell you what the standards are for hiring a historic architect, a qualified historic architect. And then our administration staff who can help you out with the final report conference call and other administrative issues. So if you have any questions, we're here to answer them today. Please let us know.
Yeah, if any of you have questions, you can unmute yourself and just, just state your question.
Jessica here. I have a few questions. Since I'm in the middle of a grant right now, but like trying to go forward with a better understanding. When people typically do their construction document grants, are those usually the $10,000 small grants, or do a lot of them turn out to be large grants?
For construction
Documents, like getting our architectural documents together.
Yes, it depends on the scope.
Okay.
Sometimes the project is phased, so the construction documents are pretty thin, and they can definitely be done with a small grant. An entire building construction project would definitely fall into the large grant category.
And then I'm just gonna keep jumping in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Looking at budget stuff, construction admin, is that really like what it's going to cost for your architect to follow your grant, I guess, through construction?
Right. And we get that question a lot, but that is an important position. So you want to ensure that you have someone hired, well, the architect that you've been working with likely is hired to observe your construction sites and keep the communication open, look for issues, make sure the work meets standards.
And then I have another question about adding contingency in. The 10% is great. Does that go line item by line item, or should there be a separate line item at the bottom that just says contingency in it?
It's just a regular line item. Just be sure it's clearly defined as contingency.
Okay.
So it will figure in your total request.
Perfect.
Yep. Did you have any more questions, Jessica?
I guess the other thing I just want to comment is like we're very rural. We're in a very small rural town, and I guess I would just out to like anyone else listening how to find a good architect in a rural community or around a rural community, and then finding those constructors as well. I guess that's just a struggle of ours, and it's not really a question. I guess it's just more of a comment that we can't always find the most qualified people we would like. So
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of people that would agree with you about that problem.
okay.
And again, it's good to start searching by consulting the Preservation Specialist Directory. There are a few architects who are willing to commute up to the north to do projects. So look in the metro area as well if you can't find anyone in you that's local.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
One thing I wanted to mention is if, you know, with everything that's going on at the moment and maybe going on for some time, you know, if you have any concerns about your grant, that you might need an extension, that your scope is going to have to change, you know, anything like that, the thing to do is send a request to the grants email, which is grants@mnhs.org. Send an email to us requesting, you know, an amendment request report, and we'll set that up for you. And then you can use that to, you know, tell us about, you know, any problem that you have, and, you know, maybe what solution you think is going to work for it. You know, at the moment, we don't know a lot more than most of you about, you know, where things are going to go in the next few months. So, but you can always, you know, use that to request an amendment or a change. And of course, you can always just get in touch through email is the best way at the moment.
Oh, I was also going to mention that the next small grant deadline is coming up April 10th. And of course, the large grant deadline for pre-application is May 29th. Thank you for joining today. And if you think of a question, give us a call. We're happy to help.